I'm glad you cut that out of the manuscript.
Yeah, well, you know, there's something about turning a manuscript that's too perfect that I thought there would be extra pressure on you guys. I like how there's no laughter. Just awkward staring. Yes, Eric, far too perfect.
Hey, well, welcome to Erik Leavitt's defense of his MFA thesis. I thought what we'd do would be to start off with you reading for, what, maybe 10 minutes? Less?
Less.
5 minutes?
5
The
minutes.
first few pages of the thesis, if you like, or if you have a place that, a poem that you particularly like to read.
No, I was thinking the first few pages as well, sort of work. I do the first 6, since that seems like it'll take about 5 minutes.
Yeah, don't read the illustration.
That's, yes. Circle, smaller circle. Page 1. A white dwarf bursts over Herbad in 1572, an old star, collapsing to a sphere the size of the Earth. In binary systems, the denser dwarf cannibalizes its brother, adding to its own mass. It exceeds its limits. The star rips apart, nova, Tycho called it, though modern astronomy reserves the term for less violent explosions. They are rare in one galaxy. There was one in 1054. Tycho's nova was the next, then Kepler's in 1604. There have been none since. There is no example in the star heralding Christ's birth. Tycho ruled it had to be much nearer the Earth to lead anyone, anywhere. Distance is important. Measurement. 1572's moved in no relation to other stars. Radio astronomers agree. They place it far beyond the simple orbit of the moon. Over Bible lecture in 1945. Aporia, noun. Do you feel you are in control of your own well-being? Mm-hmm. How often do you talk to your family? Often. More than once a week? Sure. Wordsome, Father, and the wordsome talkless, and the dream telegraphing you, and the dream dead walking back, and along the freeway dead walking backstairs to my apartment, I'm sleeping. Screen door snaps out, and up sit your feet, tomatoes split, your feet black pork chops in the fat vein where the walking, and up I, you are messaging, and you earful, your word deads, your mud words, and pinwheel of hands, and walk you as I woke to you, as I boy woke to you in the night, passing my door to the bathroom, white-bellied arms like white underwear sad around your sad legs. And your arms now wordsome and scream and messaging out in gibber word, and your home walk to carry to something, the say your home walk, the say to me, screen door snap, and I on the couch awake, your yellow voice when I can't listen, when you're walked, Father, the freeway side, and tar gravel, your back naked, feet naked, calves naked, cars ready you in the pass light, in the emergency lane, and you up my slow stairs. To something say you wake me and my not understand. TV muds out light behind us, and my not understand. You're louder, you're wording, and out your arms white, and my teeth crack to the shape of your teeth, and out your arms like white. They make my body do things. Like what? Jumps up and down sometimes. Sometimes they make me run. He hops next to the bunk for emphasis. I get nervous sometimes. That's why they pick me up. Tell me, Muse, of the untranslatable verb, home, of being pulled off course by twice-born Dionysus, god of contradictions. Tell me of the hands need to pocket and the faces to chat, of siren lights that color his face twice. A man crosses the Mississippi Bridge twice. A man walks home on the freeway and does not remember. Unremember, Muse, his walk home that night. Unremember, corkscrewing in me like a flatworm. Tell me, O Muse, of the man losing, of the man on the freeway shoulder, so often driven home he thinks he knows the way. Tell me what he thinks he knows, Muse. Tell me police. Tell me chortle and the stomach's pull and the body shrinks and go hard. Tell me cold and walk from city to city and leave, 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 and we will go, Muse. Together we will go. The story of Tycho's inspiration reads like a Christmas pageant. He's stumbling home from a party, hating his law degree, when a pinata of light breaks open across the night, immeasurable. More than just a blip on the zodiac. Nova, he called it. After that, the cosmos was too perfect for us not to be at the center. The world of ballerina pirouetting and him, the finger on her head, everything slide ruled, longitude, latitude, giving everything an X marks the spot. But so much of life is impossible, and like the poem says, the star is a cow's eye in the sky, a palace in the ruins, spackled in its own nova, new from the Latin, then shuddering immeasurably away.
Well, I think the three of us have some questions for you. I guess I'll start with Julie.
Sure. There is a quote on page 65, I think I'll start with. On 65, there's this sudden personal narrative that seems different than everything else, and it's a call on the muse again, but it says, ask the muse to stand in his head and speak for him so he is not responsible for the story. And I was curious about the placement of responsibility in terms of who's in control of the text and in terms of the research you've utilized. A lot of the quotes that are research or that are quotes sometimes don't even feel like they are actual research anymore, that it's being Walter Bade, that it no longer is applicable to Walter Bade, that there's some other narrative taken over. And because of that, usually that research adds this kind of authority. There's a debunking of authority in that. I wonder if you could talk about how research, how these other texts, these found texts and such, play into this creation of a narrative, or this creation of a self, in terms of this worrying about who has responsibility for telling the story.
I'd be happy to talk about that. I think one of the interesting things with this page on 65 is that it brings up this idea of the invocation of the muses, which is something I was trying to work with a lot here, where part of the goal of this narrative was to figure out how to tell a story that I had no idea how to tell, which is probably one of the most kind of terrible ideas to start a manuscript with. But I began to sort of think of kind of the rhapsodic invocation of the muses, where all of a sudden there was this responsibility that was taken away from the rhapsodes by invoking a muse and sort of having someone speak through them in this dual narrative. And one of the things I was sort of interested in having research do, and as well as I guess some of these other voices do, was to kind of have these other voices to try and basically make like a chalk outline of the self by looking at forms of kind of evidence that would be around them. So trying to find something that sort of speaks with this authority, but at the same time suggests another story that's going on behind it. And then through all those suggestions, kind of making like a parallax motion of just like false self, false self, false self, false self, false self, all that until you get sort of a picture.
So you see there's maybe like a negation of the self to articulate self? Is that how that works?
I think it's the impossibility of complicating the self. One of the things I ended up thinking about quite a bit when I was dealing with was, I think it's Denise Riley. Denise Riley? Yeah, where it's the self, where at least one of the things I got from Denise Riley when she was talking about this idea of identity was the inherent impossibility of defining identity, that the moment you sort of define identity, you sort of get uncomfortable with that definition, because in defining something, you're inherently cutting other things out. And one of the things I was very interested in playing with here, and especially in the research sections, was this kind of voice of authority, this voice that sets down the rules of how the world exists, and how a person exists and things like that. And as someone kind of like inherently trying to identify something, and in that identification failing. So I guess I wouldn't call it as much a negation of the self as a view of like a multiple self.
Because I sense a lot of anxiety in trying to define the self within it, almost like this, not even inability to articulate self, but this refusal and anxiety about what self is and trying to be.
Yeah, there's very much a hesitance in the self sort of being externally defined here. And the sort of worry that that external definement is inherently wrong or inherently misleading. So I guess part of the way I approach this is kind of as a conspiracy theorist, where there are all these different definitions that go on, and my hope is that, like, as a reader, sort of reading this, you end up putting things together based on that, or trying to find connections that may be there and some that may not even be there, as that seems to be, for me, the kind of core truth of the self here, this idea of connecting with something that may or may not be there. In the same way, it's sort of, in the same way that the text is almost using research to try and identify the self, the process of reading the manuscripts, I also hope sort of an identification of the self.
Well, there are a lot of other self-defining documents in the text, the notes, and I am drawn to the comment that was made in one of the dialogues. You don't look like you did when we brought you in. You look more normal. I think that's the quote.
Yeah. And it's one of the things I sort of get stuck on is this, even the view we sort of have to construct of ourselves when we're dealing with something. And that, like, the view you have of yourself in a situation might not be the actual in a situation. So there's a lot of play, I think there's a lot of play with that throughout.
I'm curious about the, I mean, sort of taking something that I agree that Jody mentioned. When I come across the quotes, I'm almost immediately aware that I don't think they're quotes. And they're, I mean, you were talking about the self being sort of imagined as maybe a sort of approach from various sort of points of view. So, I mean, it's curious to me that you've got sort of like, you've established something like a tripartite sort of structure, you know, quite often at the top bit of the page that's got one sort of role in the text, the central portion, and then the bottom portion. It seems to me that I just would like you to talk a little bit about the role of those three parts, maybe, but also I'm curious about the bleeding in between those parts, because it seems to me that one of the things that makes me feel confident that the quotes aren't quotes is the similarity between the writing in those quotes and in the central sections. So it seems to me there's no attempt to sustain a kind of fantasy that this is, you know, I'm using this type of rhetoric here, and I'm using this type of rhetoric here. There's a sort of, there's a house rhetoric that sort of merges all sections of the time, it seems to me.
Right. Part of that for me is kind of going back to this idea of indication and of kind of taking on another persona, or kind of being possessed. I guess when we watch Linda Blair in The Exorcist, we're sort of aware of her as like an image of Satan at the end, but we're also still aware of her as a daughter at the same time. And there's that inherent kind of like cover over of personality. And that's part of the bleed through I see here. Part of this is identification through reflection. or through a series of like imperfect twins and things like that. So there are, like each section I want to have kind of different goals, but at the same time, because there is sort of a single story and a single narrative here and a single narrator, I want sort of that, I'm not worried about that person kind of bleeding through in all aspects.
In keeping with that, then, it seems when I'm reading this, I'm curious about the role of the actual story of Tycho Brahe. I'm sort of, when I read this, I don't feel, you know, there are certain poets that might bring in, I might be one of them. There are other poets, even apart from me, that might bring in a sort of historical figure and not manipulate it in ways so that you're asked to read that other thing metaphorically. And it seems to me what I'm curious about here is why his particular story seemed important to you. And because I mean, I don't read this manuscript and think I'm learning about Tycho Brahe and I'm reading his life story in reality, or his sort of methodology, or his sort of obsessions, and understanding those as being sort of metaphorically significant in terms of the, you know, the individual voice here, or poetry, or knowledge of self and world. It seems to me that. Tell me a little bit about why he was the choice, and what you think why his significance sort of manages to sort of matter in this.
Well, one of the reasons he's there is just plain neurosis on my part, which isn't a particularly good thesis answer, but I feel like it needs to be sort of mentioned. The others are hopefully better thesis answers, in that sort of in becoming neurotic about Mr. Brahe, I began to see sort of a parallel between like the very small physical story of basically someone trying to cross a bridge and get home, like literally cross a bridge and get home, to some of the stuff that was happening in a Tycho Brahe biography. So in one way, it was a parallel narrative that I could sort of talk about or manufacture that would mirror a narrative I couldn't figure out how to say directly. But I guess he also became a more important figure in a number of the ways of, a number of symbolic ways, in both being someone who's a keen observer, but in being sort of a fantastic observer, makes false assumptions, and being someone who can, you know, make these amazing measurements using only his naked eye, he sort of misjudges that and comes up with this false construct of how the world exists. And having that moment come from this idea of a nova, which is not only the creation of something, but sort of like a negative inspiration, an inspiration that's inherently destructive, and an inspiration which sort of creates a dualness, where it's sort of like one thing starts collapsing while another thing starts to be born within it. And through burning itself up, it becomes something greater than itself for a moment. And in a way that not only sort of inspires the Nova to be something larger than it is, it inspires Tycho to be something larger than it is. And a lot of both the Nova and Tycho are about compulsion there. And I think that's sort of one of the overlying themes of this, is being compulsed by things and rules outside of the self to operate in a certain way. I guess there's also an aspect of creator in Tycho, kind of with that inspiration of someone who's creating false models of the world as well, and kind of this sort of destructive inspiration and destructive creation
So then I think that becomes a discussion of the poetics of the manuscript. Or, I mean, I'm curious about. There are times when it seems that it is conscious about the role of the artist, and the muse is evoked, and it's a sort of and then breakdown. I mean, quite often what happens is, I mean, it seems almost to be, if it has a poetics, its poetics is one of sort of, it's a danger. Creation is dangerous in a way, it seems to me, or inherently sort of born of sort of damage or created damage in a way. I think that's right.
Yeah, there's an inherent kind of failure of creation, or of like, I guess creation isn't the right word that I'm looking for. I think there's a failure in replication here. And I don't know if the text right now is really separating out the idea of creation and replication, but I know one of the fears for me in the text is this idea of the impossibility of replication and the sort of moment of trying to replicate something breaking down, but also striving to replicate something being both kind of an artistic journey and a destructive or dangerous journey. So in a way, yeah, there is this sort of poetics of destruction, I guess, or poetics of sacrifice, even. Not just in sort of the construction of writing, but in just the construction of reality here.
Yeah, because it seems very anxious and all of that. Like, there's an anxiety that what's being copied, even if the copy is absolutely perfect, there's a fear in that what had been copied in itself was somehow false, like with the twins, right?
Right.
You have the twins in the womb, and there's one of the poems where strangely it becomes a realization, the parchment, that the twin wrapping the other in the parchment, but suddenly it's as though the speaker isn't the one being wrapped. The speaker is the thing that's wrapping the other. So there's this weird duplicity and skin and selfhood being kind of established. You do have a lot of other dualities within the poem and kind of this anxiety about these dual selves, even themselves not being functional. I wonder if you could maybe talk about some of the dualism that you're playing with. Does that make sense?
Yeah. One of the things I'm sort of interested, I guess, even in sort of my own life with this kind of invocation of the muses that I kind of inherently do, is that is the kind of way we can make memory also almost hallucinatory, and that we're sort of existing with different ghosts of ourselves, and ghosts of these other people who are around. And at some points, when you start trying to identify the self, you become one of those ghosts. That in this act of identification, you're not even really that useful in trying to figure out who you are. And there can be an inherent confusion then, where are you then are you the spirit being invoked by this imaginary self, where all of a sudden you have equal value to all these other imaginary figures? The narrator has equal value to Tycho, which isn't a very useful thing, being as Tycho is dead and prosthetically knows. So it's
I think there's worse.
I would think so, but there are a lot more dead people than there are.
I think being dead and also hard of hearing.
Right.
Dead trumps.
Yeah, death is the hardest of hearing.
Right.
So there is this sort of duality in that, but there's also this kind of worry of where a voice is coming from. When I was thinking about this, I started thinking about there's the sort of English 205 description of the metaphor, where someone will draw half a coin on the board, and it's like a metaphor is half a broken coin. You don't have to put in the other half of the broken coin, and everything is happy. And that's sort of how I'm seeing some of the dualities here, where it's like half of the self and then half of this sort of voice or personality or costuming or whatever. But the problem ends up being that there's not sort of a clear split between that. I guess instead of like a coin, it's like adding Kool-Aid powder to water. So you're never sure, once you start kind of dossing that out, which part you're receiving. Are you receiving the Kool-Aid or the water? So there's this inherent worry of whether, I guess, of authenticity and the self, and the possibility that the self is hallucinatory.
I mean, the passage she picks up, there's a possibility that the self is that which was consumed, was one of the original twins, and the self is absent and dead, and that what's left is sort of like symptoms of that which consumed or something like that. That seems to haunt part of this excerpt quite a bit, I think.
Yeah. There's also the sort of interesting aspect of the vanishing twin syndrome where all the symptoms that define it are incredibly common symptoms.
Yeah.
Like unexplainable feelings of loss and occasional depression, which I think are symptoms of like a third of diseases. So it could just be that you have a cold or your low blood sugar or you ate your own brother. So there's also this sort of worry of finding origins or trying to find the real start or the real instance of something.
In the same way, you seem to deal a lot with true and false documentary materials throughout the relationship, throughout the thesis, so that we're always kind of, I mean, as Martin said, we're not sure that the quotes are really quotes, and yet then we'll see a photocopied page of a medical test,
Right.
which I think we can take as valid, although we don't know whose test it is necessarily. Could you talk a little bit about that sort of ambiguity and put it in relation to some of your influences? You've mentioned Denise Riley. I'm wondering if there were other forebears.
There, I made a list. There are a number of forebears. Probably one of the most useful ways to start talking about this is for another project I was doing last year, I was looking at all this Sasquatch research. And one of the fascinating things that I found with one of the authors is there's this guy writing about Sasquatch kinematics. Looking at that famous footage from the 70s and trying to figure out how Sasquatch moves and whether or not he's an ape. And in every sort of example, he would make this comparison to himself. So, like, as we can see here, Sasquatch has like a 2-foot by 4-foot gait. And I'm going to compare that to myself when I was a runner in high school. And, Sasquatch has big arms, so therefore he can probably lift as much as like a regular ape. And then to compare that, I can bench press 250 pounds. And in a way, it started to, it had both this incredibly strange language and a strong enough voice to put down these sort of linguistic terms with authority. And at the same time, it involved this kind of piecing together of evidence and this kind of distrust of that authority to try and find the story behind it. So that's a lot of the kind of the influences I was looking at were something that would either have this kind of creation of evidence and detective work that goes into it, or this kind of strange authority that I immediately don't trust. So, like, in equal parts, like something like that Sasquatch research was interesting. That's where the Tycho research becomes interesting, or like stuff on astronomy or vanishing twins. But some other kind of works and pieces that I've seen do that, or that I was thinking about that do that, would be like In the Lake of the Woods by Tim O'Brien, Dictee by Teresa Shaw. I think there's a way that some of Frank Bedard's monologues do that, where you're kind of getting these various perspectives on things. And I actually find a lot of nonfiction sort of does that. I end up being very interested in something that's, and I think this comes through in this manuscript as well, that something that's not only telling a story, but that's telling the story of perception as well, which seems to be something that's more and more popular with kind of lyric nonfiction. Something like, I guess John got us the example that comes to mind initially. And then there are a few kind of linguistic models. I guess for a lot of the language, there's this way that Hank Azaria on The Simpsons does impersonations of celebrities, but he does them so poorly that they become another voice. And that's often what I found myself doing here. And one of the impersonations I was trying to do kind of over and over again is Philip Levine from They Be They Lion. To have this slippage of text as one of the things I've noticed is I really hope I'm dyslexic. Because if I get tired or I start talking fast or something like that, language will always mesh together. Or there'll be this moment where I start muttering and people mishear me, and whatever they mishear is significantly more interesting than what I've said. And I was trying to figure out a way of employing that. And that sort of slippage between speaker and listener, or like person and person. And I guess that's one of the things that I think happens with that documentation, is that it has this feeling of authority, but it also has the feeling of something going on behind it or something missing. Or the fact that it's from someone claiming that great of authority that it immediately has a slip in the language. And I try and, one of the interesting things in sort of putting that in a manuscript that questions perception is that you inherently have to start questioning some of those things, even some of the images, which I feel like are the things I least question when I look at them in a manuscript. I'm sort of interested in having an interaction with and kind of looking behind.
It's kind of interesting to me to try and think of this book in terms of its where you imagine it fitting in terms of its genre. But I think one of the things that I found curious about relating the central passages, for example, which seem to me to be, maybe bear more in relation to what we were talking about dyslexia, but they have that Phil Levine sort of They Be They Lion weirdness of grammar, deliberately sort of clashing. And it seems to me that, and maybe a little bit of the sort of bid arts of anxiety and sort of almost like a sort of possession of this particular anxious sort of tense moment. It's interesting to sort of read that, which, in a text that was purely. You could go outside and tell them to pipe down. You whistle in the hallways if they want. What I'm curious about is when you read Phil Levine's book, there's no sort of break or crack in the sort of coherence of it. When you read, Frank Bedard, you're not really asked to sort of step away from the performance at any stage. And so what that ends up doing is sort of pushing it into your face a little bit. Here, it's kind of different, because you get these moments of intense performance, and then they are put against, outside, like the medical forms, or illustrations from old books. And what that ends up doing is sort of separating that section in terms of its sort of inherent emotional sort of intensity from the overall sort of structure of the book. The structure of the book seems more constructed by somebody that's in charge, or not incoherent. And so there's sort of like an interesting sort of difference between your work and Phil Levine, and it might be a difference between your work and lyric poetry generally. That's what I'm sort of thinking. So I'm wondering if you could talk about what you think lyric poetry is, as opposed to, say, lyric essay, and what you think your work is.
I guess one of the ways I've started to think of lyric poetry, and I'm still sort of conflicted on how you think about this in a series of instances of lyric poetry, is there's kind of like this voyeurism going on. I think about the Alan Grossman example, where it's kind of like watching a conversation between two people, neither of whom might be the poet, and kind of feeling that moment of voyeurism, or that you're getting something that they wouldn't normally be sharing with you. And I feel like one of the things that wants to do is have this kind of definite authority, almost like a scientific authority with it. That this is the way I am, and this is the way I'm existing. Even if, like you're using the Grossman example, the definition that it's creating is of someone who's not the poet. It's of someone kind of imagined as the poet. But I guess part of what I find myself doing when I read something like a book of poems, and this may well be the wrong way to read it, I tend to find myself reading with almost this imaginary individual in mind, and trying to figure out, who they are. Even if it's not, doing sort of a biographical reading that may not be the biography for the writer. And that interaction, for me, seems to be one of the interesting things with like a lyric essay versus a lyric poem, where I feel like a lyric poem still feels as though it's trying to articulate a single self. And one of the complications I was having here is that in trying to articulate a single moment, Heisenberg just came in and screwed everything up. Because in order to articulate one moment, there are a dozen different things you have to sort of talk about. You need to talk about the context of the moment and sort of the associations of the moment, maybe like a parallel instance of the moment, in order to get this multiple layer understanding. So that's one of the things I've started to notice more in like a lyric essay structure, where you kind of have to Sherlock Holmes your way through. And as opposed to just reading the theories that the bits give you, you have to read the theories and behind the theories and sort of assemble them.
What I find really interesting about that, when you talk about the voyeurism and about maybe within the context of the manuscript, as a reader, and I mentioned anxiety, but because I feel so anxious when I'm done reading it, as though every time I got close to figuring out who the self was that was trying to articulate himself, I kept being thrown away. Every time I started getting towards the center, I was thrown in a different direction. So I never felt like I actually got to understand the self, whether it be a false self, whatever that was trying to be created. And so I was interested in you saying that about the voyeurism, this, as maybe us as readers trying to create a sense of the selves in here in order to find that one self. But I feel whether or not maybe, I don't even know how to articulate this necessarily, as though there's almost a fear. You mentioned that quote by Denise Riley about her saying how the self maybe isn't as complicated as we might like. And there seems to be a little bit of a fear for me of the self trying to be articulated, that maybe they are overly simple. And so there's this additional convolution of who or what they might be. or almost this fear of actually finding out what that actual self might be. Like if they found out that they were the brother that was consumed, or maybe they were just the skin. So I'm wondering, I don't know how to articulate necessarily my question, but I'm concerned, or a little bit concerned overall, by if it's this effort to articulate a self, I feel like the selfish doesn't want to be articulated.
Yeah, one of the problems I sort of run into, and this is sort of gets back to the, I think, lyric poetry thing, is that the self I'm trying to articulate here is, I think one of the things that happens, at least in a lyric poem, is the self becomes a unit, like a fun-sized candy bar of self. And the self, I think that I was trying to articulate here is the self as reaction. And it's the self, that the self doesn't exist within its own little Snickers wrapper. It has to exist kind of within the other bag of Snickers and the kid's holding it. So it has to exist within the context of situation and the context of metaphor and the context of surrounding. So the self as existent in community. So I guess in that way, you can't re-separate the Kool-Aid from the water. I guess unless you put it in the microwave. Yeah, I think so. You can't separate the self out from all this other stuff, but but there not being a way to articulate that. That in articulating it, you inherently have to separate the self.
So there's that aspect of failure, the futility of even trying to articulate yourself?
It's a frustration in a way, because I think the way we understand the self at a basic level isn't complicated. Like, describe what you are. Like, well, I'm this, I'm that noise when I hit me, which is not complicated. If I have to ask to pick me out of a lineup, I can do it in most circumstances. But somehow when I need to sort of explain how that process is done, it becomes mysterious. So I think there is this feeling of the self being a very simple thing, and then a frustration of the self being misunderstood or misconstrued by the greater world, because if the self is, this simple, if I can pick me out of a lineup, why can't you? Basically.
So distance is also mentioned in the manuscript as being this, or as being contemplated as whether or not it's necessary perhaps in trying to understand the self. Maybe perhaps like how Schopenhauer, you look back through history through the other side of the telescope and focus back on it. So with the self, perhaps it's being articulated here, in that distancing, the context, does the context provide the distancing, or is it inherently impossible to actually have distance in the self when trying to articulate the self?
I think here the twinning provides the distance. Often I've thought about the self here as like trying to look directly at the sun, which, as I understand, just causes cataracts if you do it. There's sort of this impossibility of getting directly around it. And this problem with trying to look at stars, that some ways the only times you could measure stars was the fact that something would pass in front of them, and you would get this outline of it. So in this aspect of like that twinning in order to find something in contrast to something else, I think what's happening here is through this twinning there's just a series of contrasts and a series of trying to interpret the self by saying it's something else. I guess this is probably just a really convoluted version of Pablo Neruda or something like that. Just coming up with metaphor after metaphor after metaphor after metaphor. But also this inherent problem that we, or at least I, when I've sort of been trying to figure out stuff for the self, part of the process of figuring out stuff for the self is not only in trying to make that twinning or looking for another example, but then the fact that that example kind of reshapes back. That you kind of silly putty onto the newspaper, and when you pull it back, you get a distorted version of what's on the other side. So It's trying to look at the self in a series of relationships. And the problem is that the self always changes once you get outside a series of relationships. I think it's Confucianism kind of works off that theory, and I think whichever European philosopher read a lot of Confucianism, it starts with K, that I expect you to know, but unfortunately the relation of the self here is falling apart in relation. But it's sort of in this inability to define the self as an individual, but only define the self in a relationship. And that's, I think, what this is trying to do, is macrameing the self.
We are running out of time. So what I'd like to do is to ask all of you to leave, and Eric to ask you to leave instead of that, so that we can deliberate a little bit. And
All right.
We'll
He
be
comes
here.
back and you don't.
Yes. He
Yeah.
will come back. You may scamper under
Look at
your
you.
way.
Well, all right.
You know, you won't go to where you...
Right, now, I was just going to go directly into a bottle.
Maybe you should get some of the revolts.
Right, right. Genie land?
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah, thanks. Can we get him to turn off his video camera?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, let's just break it
Take it out.
so that we can say evil and foul things about him.